neighbor. I never paid much attention to the house next door. It had been empty for years, its paint peeling, the lawn overgrown. It was just another abandoned home in our quiet neighborhood, until someone moved in. I first noticed signs of life when I came home late one evening. A single dim light flickered in an upstairs window, casting strange shadows against the curtains. It wasn't much, but it was enough to catch my attention. The next morning, the for sale sign had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. No moving trucks, no signs of unpacking, just stillness. I never saw my new neighbor, not fully anyway. There were glimpses. A figure in the upstairs window at odd hours, a shadow slipping behind the curtains when I looked over. I assumed they were a recluse, someone who valued their privacy. But then the noises started. Late at night, I'd hear strange sounds from their house. Scraping, dragging, a rhythmic tapping against the walls. At first, I ignored it, convincing myself it was just the house settling. But as the nights wore on, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. One evening, while taking out the trash, I caught a glimpse of something that sent a shiver down my spine. The curtains in my neighbor's upstairs window were open, and someone was standing there. A tall, gaunt figure, their face obscured by darkness. They weren't moving, just standing, watching. I felt a cold sweat break over my skin. I forced myself to look away, but the unease lingered. That night, the noises were worse than ever. A loud thumping against the walls, a scraping sound like nails on wood. And then, around 3 a.m., I heard it. 3 slow, deliberate knocks at my back door. I froze in bed, my heart hammering. No one knocked at the back door. No one should have been back there. I waited, barely breathing, hoping it was my imagination. But then the knocking came again. Knock, knock, knock. I grabbed my phone, my hands trembling. I didn't dare move closer. Instead, I turned on my porch light through an app, illuminating the backyard. Nothing. The knocking stopped. I waited for what felt like hours before exhaustion overtook me. The next morning, I checked my security footage. My stomach turned. At 3:02 a.m., the camera picked up movement, something shifting in the shadows near my back door. A tall, thin figure. The image was grainy, but one detail stood out. The person wasn't facing the door. They were standing with their back to it, motionless. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I had to find out who or what was living next door. That evening, I built up the nerve to knock on their front door. No answer. The house looked abandoned, as if no one had lived there for years. But as I turned to leave, the door creaked open a few inches. The hallway beyond was dark. A smell of damp wood and something else, something rotten, wafted out. "Hello!" My voice wavered. Silence. Then, from the shadows inside, a whisper. A voice so soft I barely caught the words. "Help me." Every instinct told me to run, but something about that voice held me in place. I stepped inside. The air was heavy, stale. The house was nearly empty, no furniture, no decorations. Just dust-covered floors and walls lined with deep scratches. The only light came from the stairwell at the end of the hall. A single bulb flickered at the top. And there, at the landing, stood my neighbor. They were unnaturally tall, their limbs too long, their head tilted at an impossible angle. Their eyes, black, sunken hollows, locked onto mine. I stumbled back. My breath hitched as the figure took a slow, jerking step toward me. "Help me!" The whisper came again, but this time it wasn't coming from them. It was coming from the walls. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me. My heart thundered in my chest as I sprinted home, locking every door and window. The police didn't believe me when I called. By the time they checked the house, it was empty. No furniture, no scratches, no sign anyone had ever lived there. But that night, I heard it again. Knock, knock, knock. And when I checked the window, the figure was standing in their house, watching me, smiling. The Whispering House. I've always believed that neighbors should keep to themselves. It's easier that way, no forced small talk or awkward invitations. So, When the house next door was finally bought after standing empty for years, I didn't bother introducing myself. I figured they'd appreciate the privacy just like I did. At first, the new neighbor was barely noticeable. His name was Mr. Calloway, a thin man in his 50s with sunken eyes and skin that looked stretched too tightly over his face. He rarely came outside, and when he did, it was only to take out the trash or retrieve a package. The few times our paths crossed, he nodded without saying a word. It started with the whispers. Late at night, when everything was still, I would hear faint voices coming from his house. They were too low to make out any words, just a soft, steady murmur, like someone talking in their sleep. At first, I convinced myself I was imagining things, or maybe the sound was carrying from another house down the street. But the whispers grew louder with each passing night. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I stood by my bedroom window watching his house. The lights were off, but I could see shadows moving behind the curtains. Tall, thin figures gliding silently from room to room. My heart hammered in my chest, but I couldn't look away. I stayed there for hours, watching those shadows until the first light of dawn. The next day, I noticed something else. His windows were always closed, even on the hottest days, and the curtains, they were nailed shut. I tried not to think about it, but the whispers followed me. Every night, they grew louder, like they were seeping through the walls. Couldn't sleep. I would lay awake, staring at the ceiling, straining to make out what they were saying. Sometimes I thought I heard my name. Other times, I heard laughter, low, breathless laughter that made my skin crawl. One night, I heard something else. Knocking. Soft, rhythmic knocks coming from the wall behind my bed, the wall that separated my house from his. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more knocks. It went on for hours. I didn't sleep at all that night. By the next morning, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I glanced out my window, I saw Mr. Calloway standing in his yard, staring at my house. He would stand there for hours, motionless, his sunken eyes fixed on my windows. I thought about calling the police, but what would I tell them? That my neighbor was standing in his own yard? That I was hearing whispers through the walls? They'd think I was crazy. Then the smell started. It was faint at first, something sickly sweet, like rotting fruit, but it grew stronger, filling my entire house. I searched everywhere, but I couldn't find the source. It was coming from the wall. The same wall where the knocking had come from. That night, the knocking returned. Louder this time. More urgent. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 more. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart pounding. Let me out. The voice was barely more than a breath, but I heard it clear as day. I stumbled back, covering my mouth to stifle a scream. I couldn't stay in the house. I grabbed my keys and ran out the front door, not stopping until I was several blocks away. I called the police from a payphone, breathless and shaking. They came within the hour, but when they knocked on Mr. Calloway's door, there was no answer. They broke down the door. The house was empty. No furniture. No signs that anyone had ever lived there. Just bare floors and walls stained yellow with age. But the smell was still there, thick and choking. They searched the entire house, top to bottom. In the basement, they found the bodies. 3 of them, wrapped in plastic, stuffed behind the walls. They'd been there for years. The police never found Mr. Calloway. They said the house had been vacant for over a decade. But I know what I saw. I still hear the whispers at night, and sometimes I hear knocking. The man next door. I never paid much attention to my neighbor, Mr. Hensley. He was an old man, living alone in the creaky Victorian house next to mine. His yard was overgrown, his curtains always drawn, and the only sign of life was the dim flicker of a television screen at night. People in the neighborhood whispered about him, saying he was strange, that his wife had disappeared years ago, and no one knew where she went. I didn't care much for rumors. That was until I started noticing things. It began with the noises. At night, when the neighborhood was still, I would hear muffled sounds coming from his house, scraping like furniture being dragged, and soft, shuffling footsteps. Sometimes, I'd hear a faint knocking, rhythmic and insistent. I told myself it was just the old wood settling. That's what I wanted to believe. Then, I saw him watching me. One evening, as I was closing my blinds, I caught a glimpse of Mr. Hensley standing at his window, peering into my house. His pale face was barely visible behind the dusty glass, but I knew he was staring right at me. I shuddered and quickly shut the blinds. Over the next few days, I tried to ignore him, but the noises got worse. One night, I woke up to the sound of loud thumping coming from his house, followed by a sharp, agonized scream that made my blood run cold. I sat up in bed, heart pounding. Should I call the police? Before I could decide, the noise stopped abruptly, plunging the night into an unsettling silence. The next morning, I saw him in his yard. He was digging a hole, a deep pit in his overgrown garden. His frail body hunched over as he worked the shovel into the earth. He moved with slow, deliberate effort, his breath visible in the chilly morning air. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. When he finally noticed me watching, he stopped digging and stared back. No expression, just a hollow, empty stare. That night, I locked every door and window in my house. My mind was racing. What if he had killed someone? What if that scream was real? I barely slept, every creak of my house setting me on edge. 3 a.m., I heard it again. The knocking, but this time it was coming from my house. A soft, steady rap against my bedroom wall. My breath caught in my throat. I lay frozen, listening. The knocking continued, slow and deliberate, as if someone, or something, was trying to get my attention. I gathered enough courage to get out of bed. My fingers trembled as I flipped on the hallway light. The house was silent. I checked every room, every closet. Nothing. Then I saw my back door. It was unlocked. I was sure I had locked it. Positive. My stomach twisted into knots as I carefully locked it again, my hands shaking. I needed to get out of this house. I needed to leave, but I never got the chance. The power went out. Darkness swallowed everything. I fumbled for my phone, but before I could turn on the flashlight, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Breathing. Shallow, raspy breathing just behind me. I spun around, my pulse hammering in my ears. In the darkness, I could barely make out a figure standing in the hallway. A tall, shadowed silhouette. Mr. Hensley. I tried to scream, but his hand was over my mouth before I could make a sound. His grip was impossibly strong for someone so old. My struggles were useless. The last thing I remember was his voice, whispering into my ear, "You shouldn't have been watching." 3 weeks later, the neighborhood barely noticed when I disappeared. People assumed I had moved away. My house was put up for sale, my belongings gone as if I had never been there. And Mr. Hensley? He was still there, still tending to his garden, the freshly dug soil settling over something beneath it. The neighbor next door. I first noticed him the night I moved in. My new apartment was nothing special, just a one-bedroom unit in a quiet complex on the outskirts of town. Cheap rent, decent location, and close enough to work that I wouldn't spend hours commuting. Everything seemed fine, until I met my neighbor. I was hauling the last of my boxes inside when I caught movement from the unit next door. A man stood just outside his door, watching me. Not in a casual, neighborly way, no wave, no smile. Just standing there, eyes locked on me, expressionless. "Hey!" I called, giving an awkward nod. "I'm your new neighbor." He didn't respond, just kept staring, his pale face barely visible in the dim light of the hallway. Unnerved, I quickly stepped inside and shut the door, brushing it off as someone who just wasn't very social. That night, as I was unpacking, I heard something, a scratching sound, faint, rhythmic, coming from the wall separating my apartment from his. It stopped after a few minutes, but something about it made my skin crawl. I told myself it was nothing, maybe a rodent in the walls or pipes settling, but deep down I wasn't convinced. The Watcher. Over the next few days, I kept catching glimpses of him. He was always watching. Every time I left for work, he'd be standing by his door, When I returned, he'd be there again, motionless, eyes hollow. I never saw him actually enter or leave his apartment. He was just there. I stopped trying to greet him. Something about him made my stomach twist with unease. Then the noises started again. First, it was the scratching. Then came the whispering. Low murmurs, too muffled to make out, but undeniably coming from the other side of the wall. It didn't sound like a phone call or a TV. It was something else. The way the voice spoke, it felt intentional, like it wanted me to hear it. One night, I pressed my ear to the wall. The whispering stopped immediately, and then something tapped. Tap, 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 right against the spot where my ear had been. I stumbled back, heart hammering, staring at the wall as silence filled the room. Something was wrong with my neighbor. The discovery. I needed to know more. The next morning, I asked the building manager about him. "Oh, you mean Mr. Lorne?" she said, frowning. "He's been here forever. Keeps to himself. Strange fellow. Has he always been like that?" I asked. She hesitated. "Well, there was an incident a few years back. Something about a break-in, but he never filed a police report. Just started acting weirder afterward. That night, I decided to do some investigating. I waited until after midnight when everything was silent. Then, I crept out into the hallway. His door was locked, of course. But as I stood there, straining to hear anything from inside, I noticed something odd. His peephole was covered. I stepped closer, my breath shallow. A small piece of paper was taped over it from the inside, as if he didn't want to see out. Or worse, didn't want something looking in. Suddenly, a shuffling sound came from inside. I bolted back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. The truth behind the walls. That night, the noises grew worse. Not just scratching, not just whispering. Something else was moving inside the walls. I lay in bed, frozen, as I heard it. Slow, deliberate movements, dragging sounds, like something crawling through the narrow spaces between our apartments. Then a voice, a whisper, so close it felt like it was right inside my room. "Let me in." I jumped up, turning on every light. My chest heaved, my skin slick with sweat. The whisper had come from the vent near the floor. I grabbed my phone and typed out a message to the building manager. "I need to talk." Now, the final revelation. The next morning, she met me at my apartment, looking concerned. "Are you sure?" she asked after I told her about the noises. "I'm not crazy," I insisted. "Something is wrong with that place. Something is inside the walls." She hesitated, then sighed. "We had a tenant before Mr. Lorne," she said quietly. "A woman lived there alone. She started telling people she heard things in the walls. Said she wasn't alone in the apartment. No one believed her." My stomach twisted. What happened to her? She disappeared. I felt ice crawl through my veins. "They found her apartment locked from the inside," she continued. "No signs of forced entry. Nothing stolen. But she was just gone." A horrible thought took root in my mind. "Did they ever check the walls?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She blinked. "No, why would they?" The horror unfolds. That night I couldn't sleep. The scratching was back. The whispering. The dragging sounds. Then something changed. A loud thump against the wall. Then another. And another. Like something trying to break through. I scrambled out of bed, grabbing my phone. My hands shook as I dialed 911. Before they could answer, a crack echoed through the room. I turned. The vent was open. A pair of pale hands reached out, fingers stretching toward me, followed by a face. Twisted, grinning, eyes dark pits of nothingness. I screamed, stumbling back, knocking over a lamp as I ran for the door. As I yanked it open, I saw my neighbor. Mr. Lorne stood in the hallway, his face hollow with fear. "You shouldn't have listened," he whispered. Then, behind him, his apartment door burst open. A shadowy figure lunged out, dragging him inside as he let out a scream that cut off far too soon. The door slammed shut. Silence. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was miles away, until my lungs burned and my vision blurred. I never went back. The police found nothing. No body. No signs of forced entry. Mr. Lorne was simply gone. But I know the truth. There was something in those walls. And it's still there, waiting,